By the final night, Constantinople no longer sounded like a capital. It sounded like a city listening for its own end. Beyond the walls, fires burned in the Ottoman camp. Ladders, ropes, weapons, and orders were being readied for the assault before dawn. Inside the city, people moved through streets that had carried emperors, merchants, priests, soldiers, refugees, and rumors for 1,000 years. Now those streets carried something heavier, the knowledge that the walls might not hold again. This was not only the last night before a battle, it was the last night before an old world discovered whether it could survive one more morning. For weeks, Constantinople had been surrounded. Sultan Mehmed II had brought an army, cannon, ships, engineers, and patience. The city he faced was still legendary, but it was no longer the vast imperial center it had once been. Its name carried the memory of Rome. Its churches, walls, ceremonies, and titles carried centuries of authority. But by 1453, the empire behind that authority was dangerously small. The Ottomans did not need to destroy a continent. They needed to break a city. The defenders had walls, faith, experience, and desperation. They did not have enough men. The great land walls had resisted armies for generations, but gunpowder had changed what stone could promise. Each day, cannon fire opened gaps in the defenses. Each night, crews worked by torchlight to pack the damage with timber, earth, rubble, and whatever strength remained. The siege was no longer pressing from outside. It had entered the city's rhythm. To stand inside Constantinople that night was to live inside layers of memory and fear. The city was not empty, but it was diminished. Whole areas felt hollow. Houses stood in the shadow of walls that once seemed permanent. In narrow streets, families gathered possessions, touched door frames, watched candle flames, and listened for signs beyond the ramparts. The air held smoke, sea wind, wax, sweat, and the sour fatigue of people who had stopped pretending the danger was temporary. Near the walls, defenders waited in damaged positions. Some were Byzantine soldiers, some were foreign allies, some were men pulled toward the defense because there was nowhere else for loyalty to go. Their hands were raw from lifting stones, dragging supplies, and carrying water to places where masonry had become earthworks. Beyond the darkness, the Ottoman camp answered with its own sound: animals, tools, drums, commands, metal, movement. It was preparation on a scale the city could hear but not stop. In the churches, people prayed not as comfort, but as last resistance. Candles moved beneath domes that had seen coronations, processions, triumphs, betrayals, and plague. Outside, Emperor Constantine XI moved through the city not as a distant symbol, but as a ruler with almost nothing left to spend except presence. On this night, authority meant staying. The danger sharpened because the next hours had a shape. This was not another day of bombardment followed by repairs. The city could feel an assault being assembled. Outside the walls, units were moved into position. Ladders were carried forward. Ditches and broken ground were prepared for crossing. Men waited behind the dark line of the siege works, close enough for the defenders to sense order gathering beyond the fires. The noise was not random. It was organized pressure, building toward one direction. Inside the walls, the response was smaller, faster, and more desperate. Stones were shifted to weak points. Barrels, beams, and earth were dragged toward breaches. Men checked gates, counted weapons, adjusted armor, and returned to posts where they knew the first impact would fall. Messengers crossed through narrow streets with information that could not make the city stronger, only more aware. Every part of Constantinople was pulled toward the same morning. Churches held the frightened, walls held the exhausted, streets carried the last supplies, gates became places where survival would narrow into seconds. Courage was not the absence of fear here. It was the decision to remain in position while the attack gathered outside. The real shift happened before the walls were breached. It happened in the mind of the city that final night, when temporary suffering became historical ending. Constantinople had survived sieges before. Its people knew stories of rescue, endurance, and impossible defense. But this time, the old confidence had thinned. The empire was not waiting behind the city with fresh strength. The city itself was the empire. That was the unbearable truth of the night. If Constantinople fell, there was no larger Byzantine world to retreat into, no second capital waiting to inherit the ceremony, no deep reserve of power ready to restore what was lost. The court, the relics, the churches, the walls, the language of Roman continuity, the idea that this city still stood between past and future, all of it had been compressed into one besieged place. So the last night was not only military suspense, it was a human experience of compression. A civilization's remaining symbols were crowded into streets, sanctuaries, towers, and damaged defenses. The defenders were not simply guarding masonry. They were guarding the last physical shape of a world that had outlived almost everything around it. When dawn came, the final assault would turn fear into fact. The walls would be tested by men, metal, noise, smoke, and exhaustion. Some would fight, some would flee, some would be trapped between prayers and breaking gates. But the meaning of that morning had already been prepared during the night before. That is why the last night before Constantinople fell matters. It was the moment when people still lived inside a world that would soon be spoken of in the past tense. The city had not yet fallen, but it had already become fragile in a new way. Its people stood between memory and impact, between ceremony and ruin, between an empire's long inheritance and the force about to end it. History often remembers the breach, the conquest, the date. But for those inside the city, the end arrived first as waiting. A sleepless night, a wall in shadow, a candle under a dome, a ruler who stayed, a city listening to the army outside, knowing that when dawn came, the world it had protected for 1,000 years might no longer have walls.